It's not that I don't care about you. It's that I don't care about anyone.
Something is shifting in this ongoing Hollywood saga, and this time, the spotlight is swinging toward Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Newly unsealed testimony has reportedly pulled him into the edges of the legal battle surrounding Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, and Ryan Reynolds, and buried inside all of it is a feud between Johnson and Reynolds that's apparently been simmering for years, mostly out of public view. Today, it's time to pull that thread all the way through, from a tense Red Notice set to a suspiciously timed hit piece, to a character Reynolds allegedly built specifically to mock Johnson on screen. Here's where it starts. According to Justin Baldoni's deposition, his former publicist Stephanie Jones once told him that Ryan Reynolds had reportedly been really hard on Dwayne Johnson, or something close to that description. Baldoni testified he didn't remember the specifics and treated it as gossip at the time, but he did recall Jones mentioning a letter, and he said the fallout apparently resulted in Reynolds and Johnson never doing press together again. That's a strange detail to just casually drop into a deposition about an entirely different lawsuit, and it's exactly the kind of thread that pulls a much bigger story loose. Jones represented Johnson and his production company for years before their working relationship ended, and if there's one thing we've learned from this entire saga, watching it unfold deposition by deposition, it's that Jones was reportedly loose-lipped about her former clients, sharing details with other people in the industry that arguably should have stayed private. We've already seen text messages showing she blocked Johnson and his team from Jones' Works' Instagram account after their split. And Johnson has also turned up in a Business Insider piece, cataloging people who allegedly can't stand working with Jones. So, going into this, we already know there was bad blood on that side. Now here's where Reynolds enters the picture directly. Reynolds and Johnson co-starred in Red Notice back in 2021, and for years there were only quiet rumors that the two didn't get along. Those rumors stayed rumors until The Wrap published a story in 2024 claiming Johnson had been repeatedly and severely late to set while filming Red One, allegedly showing up 7 or 8 hours behind schedule and disrupting a $250 million production. Buried inside that same article was the first real public detail about what had gone wrong between Reynolds and Johnson on Red Notice, claiming Reynolds became furious after allegedly waiting 5 hours for Johnson, that the two of them had a heated confrontation, that Johnson stormed off set, and that they reportedly didn't speak for years afterward. That's a remarkably specific set of details for a story that had never been reported before, and it raises an obvious question. Who had that information, and who decided it was time to hand it to The Wrap? This article dropped almost exactly a year after Johnson had fired Jones as his publicist, and it landed right as he was gearing up to promote two major projects, Red One and Moana 2, along with picking up an industry award at CinemaCon. A spokesperson for Reynolds declined to comment when asked about it, which tells us nothing either way, but the timing alone makes it worth asking who benefits from painting Johnson as difficult right before a big press push. Amazon MGM, the studio behind Red One, pushed back hard, calling the extreme lateness claims ridiculous and false, and saying other sources put him at closer to an hour late rather than 7 or 8. Director Jake Kasdan and co-star Chris Evans both went further, publicly defending Johnson's professionalism. Evans specifically pointed out that Johnson often trained in the mornings before arriving on set, but that this was scheduled, known to the entire production team, and built into the day, not some surprise disruption. Kasdan echoed that same defense, saying he'd made 3 major films with Johnson and had never once seen him treat anyone on set with anything but respect, adding that being occasionally late is simply part of working in this industry and that it applies to plenty of people, not just Johnson. People magazine even dug up an old Esquire interview from 2017, years before any of this became public, where Johnson had openly joked about keeping a bottle nearby during workouts so he wouldn't have to stop training to use the bathroom. That detail somehow found its way back into the framing of the Red One story too, as though a joke he told about himself years earlier was suddenly evidence of unprofessional behavior on a film set. TMZ later ran a follow-up softening the whole thing, saying their sources described a real but far less dramatic disagreement, that Reynolds was genuinely frustrated with lateness affecting the schedule, that he addressed it directly with Johnson, and that the two of them had since resolved it. A rep for Amazon MGM also added that Johnson and his production company had been incredible partners throughout filming, and that the studio wouldn't have gotten the project finished without his work and support, which reads a lot like standard damage control, but is worth including all the same. It's worth noting Johnson isn't the only actor who's carried a reputation for being late. Vin Diesel, his former Fast and Furious co-star, has a long, well-documented history of the same thing, to the point where interviewers have waited hours just to sit down with him. That particular fallout with Diesel also became public, and the two of them stopped doing joint press appearances entirely, sometimes not even being in the same city for promotional stops on the same franchise. And on the flip side, Reynolds himself has reportedly held up productions before, too, with one account from someone who worked on The Hitman's Bodyguard describing him constantly reworking scenes and pushing his own jokes into the script, slowing filming down in the process because pages kept changing at the last minute. Lateness and rewrites causing delays isn't unique to any one person in this industry, which makes it a little more interesting that this particular framing, Johnson is the sole problem on set, is the version that made it into print, while Reynolds' own reported habit of holding up shoots for the sake of a better punchline never seems to make the same kind of headline. So, who had a reason to push that narrative? There are really only two obvious candidates here: Stephanie Jones, who had just lost Johnson as a client and had already shown a willingness to talk about him to other people, and Reynolds himself, who, according to Baldoni's deposition, had already had a serious falling out with Johnson years earlier. Neither one has been confirmed as the source, and there's no direct evidence tying either of them to the leak. But it's the kind of coincidence that's hard to look past once you line the timeline up. There's a medium deep dive by journalist Imona Dyke worth pulling up here, and it adds a piece of this puzzle that's easy to miss. Dyke's reporting points to Dude, a character Reynolds played in Free Guy, an oversized, dim-witted parody version of Reynolds' own character, speaking almost entirely in stereotypical macho one-liners with an exaggerated, cartoonish bodybuilder physique layered on top. Free Guy was reportedly in production around the same stretch of time Reynolds was still doing press for Red Notice, at least by some accounts from that period, which would mean the Dude character was being written and filmed while whatever happened between him and Johnson on that set was still fresh, though the exact overlap in timing hasn't been independently pinned down. And Reynolds didn't stop at putting the character in the movie either. He went further, filming a separate promotional video built entirely around Dude's exaggerated muscles, his obsession with protein, and jokes about growth hormones, essentially giving the joke its own life outside the film entirely, in a way that wasn't strictly necessary to sell the movie itself. Dyke doesn't claim this proves Dude was built as a direct dig at Johnson, but she lays out the timeline and the resemblance side by side and lets readers draw their own line between the two, which is worth doing here as well before deciding what that connection actually means. In one resurfaced interview clip that's circulated online, Johnson is asked what nicknames he has for his frequent co-stars, and without much hesitation, he calls Reynolds an asshole.
Gall was Queen, and Ryan was asshole.
Dwayne said Ryan's nickname was arsehole.
Oh, it's not too dissimilar at home.
He repeats a version of the same sentiment in a separate interview with Vanity Fair, and in yet another clip, when asked to describe his co-star's most annoying habits, he says, Gal Gadot's is that she's basically perfect, and then adds that Ryan's is simply that he breathes.
Ryan's most annoying habit, anytime he breathed.
Who would win in a fight between you three?
Ryan will run fast. DJ will be a gentleman and he'll stay.
He goes on in that same conversation to praise Gadot's warmth and kindness, then flatly calls Reynolds the opposite of kind. Dyke's piece also points to something Johnson said a few years later about instituting what he called a no assholes policy at his own production company, $7, explaining that reputations in Hollywood tend to follow people, and that after enough time in the industry, he'd simply decided he didn't want to work with certain types of people anymore. He never names Reynolds directly in that clip, but given everything else on record, it's not exactly subtle. And then there's the joke itself, the one that got the most attention during their Red Notice press run, where Reynolds mocked Johnson's bald head on camera in front of reporters.
Well, perhaps you could tell us, what did you say the back of his head looks like?
What did you say about the back of my head?
Yeah. Well, you know, I try to never say anything cruel to Dwayne that I know I can't get away with. But yeah, I did say the head did look not too dissimilar to a penis. I'm just gonna say his head looks like a boar penis.
Dwayne, could we see the back of your head so we can make up our own mind about where it is?
Watching that clip back, Johnson doesn't look like he's enjoying the moment. At least to me, though that's admittedly just a read on someone else's face and not a fact anyone can confirm. What's not up for interpretation is what happened next with Baldoni. Reynolds publicly framed him as thin-skinned for not laughing off being turned into Nice Pool, a character Reynolds has admitted was based directly on him, inside what became one of the highest-grossing R-rated movies ever made. Whether or not Johnson felt the same way in that moment, the follow-up pattern with Baldoni at least tells us how Reynolds tends to respond when someone doesn't play along with a joke made at their expense. None of this proves who leaked what to The Wrap, and nobody involved has confirmed any of it outright. What we do have is a set of pieces that each stand on their own, a falling out that ended joint press appearances, a suspiciously timed story, a character some viewers have read as an echo of Johnson built, while that tension was still fresh, and Johnson's own on-record comments about Reynolds, none of which individually settles anything, but taken together, it's worth asking whether this is a pattern in how Ryan Reynolds handles people he's fallen out with, or just a string of unrelated coincidences. That's really a conclusion each viewer can land on for themselves once all the pieces are laid out side by side. And if the past year of unsealed documents in the Baldoni case has taught us anything, it's that this industry runs on grudges people rarely admit to holding. Maybe Johnson got off easy compared to what eventually happened to Baldoni, who ended up mocked in front of a much bigger audience and dragged into a very public lawsuit on top of it. Or maybe Johnson simply never gave Reynolds the reaction he was looking for. And that's the real reason this story stayed quieter for so long. Neither one is confirmed, and both are just theories worth sitting with. But at some point, it's fair to ask how many times someone who crosses Ryan Reynolds can end up on the wrong end of a leaked story or a character some viewers find a little too familiar before it stops being called a coincidence. Thank you so much for watching. If this one kept you hooked, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Clout Fallout so you don't miss the next update on this story.